Welcome back, everyone, to the show. My name is Eric, and today we've got a special guest, Sophia Klewer. She is the Chief Operating Officer at PREVENCY, which is an innovative company specializing in digital resilience and crisis management through the real world and highly realistic simulation assessments doing crisis management. Sophia, thank you so very much for taking the time to join me today.
Oh, thank you for having me.
Awesome. How are you doing?
Good. I mean, fall is always the the busiest season for us in crisis exercising because lots of organizations tend to, squeeze in a little crisis exercise until year's end. So pretty busy, but won't complain about that.
Yeah, it's a lot of things happen in fall. Sometimes productivity, sometimes the calmness of working, but right now it's just leaves apparently. So that's good, and we'll hope that it stays nice and quiet.
Yep.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you before we get started in kind of the technical part of crisis management is you specifically. Now, obviously, you've done a lot. You're currently the Chief Operating Officer of PREVENCY, which is specializing in crisis management. But you've done so much already, from journalism to academia, consulting, and the digital resilience lab that you do. When you think about those things kind of from beginning to where you are now, what is a common thread that kind of ties all of those experiences together, and how did that evolve?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So I think what kind of ties it all together is that I really like to work in high pressure or under pressure and really dynamic situations. So I started out with my career in marketing, PR, and journalism. Journalism mostly as a news anchor or reporter on site. And then I noticed that I really like to do the kinds of things where you have, high pressure, you have to work fast and quick. And then when I stumbled into crisis management along the way a couple of years back, it just clicked for me, to be honest. Mm-hmm. And my take on that, though, is that crisis management today also has like a digital dimension to it, not only because we have all the digital risks nowadays, but, we have technology to help us in that field of work. And that's, kind of the red thread going through all of it, the high pressure situations, but also the communications part of it.
Yeah. And did you find were there natural segues in between those roles that you did that kind of evolved you into where you are now, or was any of that like a giant leap into something new?
So I think actually then going into crisis management was a leap away from what I was doing before, because what I was doing before was mostly communications related, journalism, marketing, PR. Even in academia, I looked at online propaganda, online communications, things like that. So then at one point in my life, I was just looking for a new challenge, I guess. And I was, scrolling through different job advertisements and found one about crisis management. And it just, as I said, it just clicked to me. And I started, I think, within a month after handing in my application, and then never left the field ever since. Mm-hmm. I now really enjoy the work. And I think there's so much value to that, not only for the profession of crisis management itself, but what you can take onto your day-to-day business task or even your personal life, being mm-hmm. more resilient, for example, in stressful situations. So much you can learn from crisis management in general. And I've actually taken that even a step further very recently, because among others, I'm a founding member of it's a senior level exchange and education community, if you will. We call it the Forum. So platform for crisis managers and everyone in the field to exchange experiences, build a community, learn from each other. And that's what it's also really all about in crisis management, not having your isolated experiences, but exchanging thoughts, just like we do today.
Yeah, for sure. It's this is a really good point that you're making. I mean, it's just the story itself segues perfectly into my next idea that I have. But in terms of management, obviously the podcast itself and the stuff that we do here is focused on leadership management, project management, in some ways the proper forms of project management, PMI focused. But in this case, for the audience to kind of know, when I was doing a podcast, I came across your article from Chaos to Clarity, and it kind of was the impetus for me to ask you to be on the show. What really stuck out in my mind was a time when I read the article was how little I actually ever thought about crisis management. And that kind of led to one of the questions that I've got for you, is that it may be obvious to some people as to why a manager and a leader or organizations as a whole should care about crisis management, because I mean, managers do focus mainly on the schedule, right? They focus on what's happening right now. And if they're doing it correctly, they're thinking about risk mitigation and how they're tracking all of those things. But I don't think, myself included, I don't think we being project managers just in the general population, have ever thought about planning for a real crisis to happen. It's just not something I thought about even a year ago when I was managing projects. So in your opinion, why should leaders, managers, and et cetera, care about crisis management?
Yeah, I mean, I think, let me start with that. What you just described is pretty common. So I think for many people, crisis management seems like a niche function, maybe, or something they not think about that like that often. Mm-hmm. I think nowadays that's kind of dangerous, to be honest, a little bit outdated, or just one. What I would like would be for people to get more into thinking about crisis management, because I would actually argue that it's one of the most vital components of management and leadership today, just because on the one hand, crisis management is not about, putting out fires when they happen. It's really about protecting business value. So in project management, that could be protecting the success of your project. But then when you look at the whole organization, it's about financial stability, operational continuity, reputation, and one thing that's really important today, stakeholder trust, so trust of your employees, of your customers. So to me, in my opinion, it's a core business function that if you don't incorporate that into your organization, will have a direct impact on the bottom line when something happens. And then another thing is that I think over the last couple of years, the risk landscape for organizations has changed a lot. We now live in a hyper-connected world, if you will, where there's just so much speed into, incidents escalating and issues escalating. And I think it was your podcast where you talked about the 72-hour rule that we have in crisis management, and to get a crisis under control. And to me, actually, in my day-to-day work, it just feels more like we now live in a world where we have to have a 7-hour rule, where you have to have everything under control so fast because situations are moving so fast. Mm-hmm. And then one last thing is that, as I said before, I think crisis management skills are universal. If you strip away the, crisis situation and everything, it's really about being clear-headed, having, clear-headed leadership, being able to make decisions under pressure, but also under uncertainty. And I think we do that every day. I think, crisis management is not rocket science, and we all are crisis managers one way or the other. But of course, you can get, more into that and prepare better. But in the end, the crisis management skills of single individuals in the organizations, but also the whole organizations, will make everyone better and stronger and more resilient to whatever will happen. And my experience is that today it's not a question of if something will happen, but when something will happen.
That's the right way to think of it. I mean, I think a lot of organizations, some do, some don't. I the story that you're telling me and how you're describing this reminds me of a situation in which our organization had lots of different projects going on. It's a large company, and they obviously have focus on many different things at different levels. And as a new project manager for that particular group, not so much the company, but for that group, and doing something a little bit different, it was for me not that I didn't just have the nervousness of being a new project manager in a field that I wasn't really. It was something I hadn't really done before. And so I had to get over the barrier of a project manager should know everything about the project. I mean, to a detail, when in fact you don't have to. If you're a really good project manager and you do it the right way, you can lead anything, even if you don't know about it. You don't have to be an expert in it. But it kind of evolved into this idea that I don't necessarily know what wrong looks like. And when things kind of start to go south, will I recognize it? And then how will I describe that to those above me and around me, that my stakeholders included, my customers specifically, as to how I'm going to manage these things. And that kind of leads me into this other thought of, in your experience, to kind of help me answer that question, what factors would you think that determine whether or not an event even qualifies as a crisis? Because in my experience, when I thought something was a crisis, and it was to me, it could have been something simple like a loss of staff or records leak. Maybe we lost data in some way, whether it was a leak, a spill, or it was taken, or it wasn't captured, period. And I took those to the management. Maybe their response to me was a bit more subtle than I expected. I thought that they would expect it to be worse, but they would say, calm down, it's not that bad.
Mm-hmm.
So in your experience, like is there something that qualifies something as a crisis?
So first of all, I think you're making a really great point here, that every one of us has a different definition, or, we all feel different about what might be a crisis. As you said, what, might be a crisis to you might not be a crisis to me, and vice versa. Yeah. And that also differs from organization to organization. I mean, we have textbook, formal definitions for crisis being a high impact, low probability event that can, threaten the very existence of your organization, and that exceeds your normal coping capacity or established procedures. Mm-hmm. And that's actually something I see a lot when working with clients. I always advocate for coming up with your own specific definition of a crisis for the organization. So defining the threshold when a situation is a crisis for your specific organization. Because just like the two of us, we could have a small enterprise and then a multinational, and, a crisis or something that's a crisis to the small enterprise might just be a little issue to the multinational because they have so much more resources and so on. Mm-hmm. So I always recommend is really looking at your organization and then defining what a crisis means to you. What are the metrics? So, for example, what business functions are impacted by that? What's the business impact overall? Can we manage that with or usual or established organization and procedures, or do we have to enter into a what we call crisis mode, where you have a different kind of structure set up next to your regular business functions, and then define that for the whole organization, get leadership on board, and have that be signed off too. So when something happens, you can then say, okay, it checks a couple of boxes, so we have a crisis. But to be honest, this gets like so much more difficult by the day, because a couple of years back, I would say the most common type of crisis we saw were what we call black swan events. So events that, come totally out of the blue. You cannot anticipate them, like the pandemic, for example, or a cyber attack or something like that. But today it's more like creeping crises, where you have all those little issues, just like you just described in the case, little incidents that then at one point lead up into like escalating into a full-blown crisis. And also, us in crisis management, we have to rethink the metrics and the assessment schemes and frameworks that we use for identifying a crisis nowadays. I think we have to rethink those a little bit due to the changing nature of crisis today. But yeah, in general, I would say there is a textbook definition, but you should then take that and go in and define what a crisis means for your organization or for your project. If you drill it down to project management, and do that before something happens. So one mistake I see crisis teams make in our exercises, in real cases, is starting to debate, do we have a crisis or don't we have a crisis, and losing valuable time while the situation is escalating and escalating. What they're still debating.
Yeah, it sounds when we think of stakeholder management and in terms of typical project management life cycles and all of the process groups that they have and so forth and so on, we often encourage, at least I know I do, other managers that are working in my organization to making sure that they tailor a specific type of project approach to a specific stakeholder, because not all of them are the same. There's this, as you've explained. In terms of crisis management, I assume that it must be the same. You must have to tailor your crisis management approach to each stakeholder, because they all have varying degrees of importance of things that are in their portfolio, or what's, of all of their assets that they have, or even what they would, as we talked about earlier, constitutes a crisis.
Yeah, for sure. 100% with you on that. I think, a crisis is not just a single event. It's a collection of impacts. And those are perceived differently depending on who you are.
Yeah.
So what I see a lot is people actually not thinking about what you just said, and just, not thinking about or forgetting about that they're dealing with a very diverse set of stakeholders in crisis situations, and that you have to tailor your approach in, managing the situation, but also communicating with the stakeholders to the specific stakeholder group. So it's a lot like project management, actually. And common methods also match those of project management. So what we recommend to our clients in crisis management is, for example, coming up with a stakeholder map, ideally before something happens. And, you do that in project management as well, where you map out the stakeholders for your project. But for crisis scenarios, organizations rarely do that, really sit down in peacetime and then map out every single group that has a stake in a certain scenario. Ask questions like, who are they? What do they value? Who's the point of contact even? List that down, and then tailor the crisis management to those groups, and especially the communication. Again, what we see often is that organizations come up with, for example, one statement and then send it out to everyone, customers, employees, investors, you name it, instead of sitting down and thinking, okay, I have a key message I want to get out there, but I have to adapt that to the stakeholders I'm dealing with. So I'm, using other words and other language when I talk to investors than when I talk to the media, for example. I have a really basic example here, but that's actually something that is forgotten lots of the time, to map out the stakeholders and not, fall into actionism, but take a step back, map out who's the most important, who you need to contact first, and so on. So a lot like project management, actually.
Yeah. There are so many ties there. I mean, it's obvious to us why these things matter and how they're so critical, and how crisis management itself is so critical just to the idea of project management. But I think the value in what we're talking about is that so many project managers who would probably listen to this podcast are not thinking about these things. They think in more of a shallow method that, hey, I've got to do risk. I've got to, identify my stakeholders. I got to do value checks, manage the variances of my financials and all those things. But those are all superficial. But when something really goes bad, I think at least from what I've seen, they just tend to go right into response mode of, let me go get the people around me to help me fix this. And there was no like plan, and they didn't really do anything right after the crisis started, or the identification of a crisis that would be about to happen. And so when they go and tell people, hey, this is what's going to happen, and the supervisors or the management would ask them, well, what have you done so far? Well, nothing. And that's not the right answer. And I think when I look back on this and I try to pen an answer to that from documentation or literature that you've written, and you're in the article that you wrote, Chaos to Clarity, you highlighted the premise of using this fast iterative process cycle and how that made the difference between operating in a cloud of confusion and making it go into clarity in that high stakes environment. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I think that's really important, especially for those agile practitioners who are already used to doing iterative approaches to doing software development and all that good stuff, applying that to crisis management.
Yeah, for sure. That's actually really important. I think we all as humans tend to fall into actionism when something happens, because we just want to do something about it. We want to fix the situation. That's what I often see in organizations, in crisis teams, instead of actually going into a crisis management circle, including a couple of steps, starting with actually situation assessment. Assessing what is the situation, what facts do we have, what are known unknowns, and how can we get the information that we need, and really assessing the situation first before going into action mode, and then observing, orienting, and then making a decision on how to move forward. Also really important. And then going into action after that. And then usually teams go into what we call a crisis rhythm. So every, 1 to 2 hours, they have a meeting and they start the cycle again. So in that meeting, they again go to assess the situation. Okay, what do we learn from that? What has changed? What new developments are there? What are our goals for the next circle phase? And then again, go into deciding what to do next, and then actually implement the measures they talked about. And that enables the teams, just like in, agile project management, to react to changes and developments really fast. And crises are dynamic situations, and you cannot fully anticipate what will happen and how the situation will escalate. So it's really, really important to be agile and be flexible in those situations, instead of having really, I'm missing the English word here, like not the agile approach, but being stuck in a certain procedure like that. So that's one part of that. What's also important in that circle is actually being able to make the decisions, and having the authority on the one hand, but also the tools at hand to make high stakes decisions. And that might go out of the usual procedures that you have, where you have certain lines of communication, where you have certain reportings that you have to make. Those might be different in a crisis situation, but you have to define all those things ideally before something happens. So it's part of the prep work to have that in your crisis management plan. And it's also important to map out that cycle, that iterative cycle beforehand, and get everyone on board so they know how, things will be run if something happens and if something comes up.
Yeah. Hey there, Eric here from the Change Agent podcast. I just wanted to take a second to say that if you really enjoy what you're watching and what you're hearing on our podcasts, please consider sharing the podcast with all of your friends and colleagues, making sure that you leave positive reviews on your favorite podcasting platform. And if you want to go a step further, which we would greatly appreciate, you could go to buzzsprout.com and find us there and make a small donation to help keep the sound on. Every little bit does help. So let's get together, let's make ourselves known, and let's be better project managers, better leaders as we move forward. Thank you again for all that you do and for watching the show and for listening. The importance of planning, and I was going to save this for later, but you probably heard this before where they say planning, failure to plan is planning to fail, something to that effect.
Yeah.
And I think that that's definitely something that project managers or organizations just as a whole need to be thinking about when it comes time for determining who's going to be running projects and whether or not they're going to have a focus on crises. I know that in terms of management and organizational approach and the tools that we have available to us, and I'm speaking personally about my experience with my company, is that we have these tools in place, techniques that we can use, assets that we have access to, whether it be historical lessons learned or whether it be some documentation that we use to identify, manage, and then sustain operations during a crisis or an event of some sort. You have OODA loops, you have red teaming, you have SWOT analysis, which is the strength, weakness, opportunities, and threats analysis that companies will typically do in a preempt to start a project. Do you think that, what are some of the tools that you've seen, probably more popular than others, I guess, that you would recommend or you've seen people using in managing their way through a crisis?
Yeah, so I think the foundation of every good crisis management is a crisis management plan. So just like a project plan, what many organizations have is a crisis management plan where we have, for example, the crisis management team. So who's included in the team? What are the key protocols? What are what is the decision-making process and so on. But what I also think is that we have to rethink what crisis management plans really are, or what they should be. I've seen plans like 100-page plans that are super detailed. But I have bad news for everyone having those plans in a crisis situation. No one will actually read them and use them because they're just not user friendly. Especially when the pressure is on. I think there's a value to going through the process of creating those plans, just thinking through some of the things in there. But what we actually need in a crisis situation is more of like a playbook approach for specific scenarios. So sit down before something happens, think about the most probable scenarios or issues or crises that could happen. And then map out the, critical first steps, checklists, stakeholders, everything we just talked about, to have that on hand, when that scenario, a similar scenario actually happen. And then when it comes to managing, the crisis, I think having a good method for making decisions is important. Many organizations use, for example, 4DEC. In my opinion, that's a little bit too complex for especially the initial phase of crisis management, where you have to, really have to make fast decisions. There, I think something like the OODA loop that you just mentioned is something that is really great to use just to get into the crisis mode, get into the process. And then actually we take a lot of tools from project management. So one thing that's always some kind of difficulty for many of the teams that I train with and that I see is situational awareness, keeping track of what is going on. And what they then tend to use is, Kanban boards, or they go to their already implemented project management tool, Kanban boards or whatever they use, and use that for crisis management. And I think that's a great approach. In a crisis situation, you don't want to have tools that you're so unfamiliar with that, you have another challenge there of how did that work again? I just don't know. Yeah. How do I start? Okay, I'm not going to use it. I'm just going to freestyle. That's what will happen then. So using the tools that you use in your day-to-day work, just, for another use case. So Kanban boards, OODA loops, or whatever, decision-making tool is good for you. Red teaming and exercising is, of course, one thing that we always recommend. Going through tabletop exercises, going through simulation exercises, and actually running through a crisis scenario, because crisis management, it's good if you have it all down in theory, but in the situation, you will notice what works and what will not work, and also how differently people will behave when the pressure is on. I think we all know that from ourselves. We might not be quite ourselves when we are in a, really under pressure, and to get to know your team in such situations, to then work better together as a team, or to be a better leader in that situation, because you understand what your team needs, is also so important. So the human factor in crisis management, and you will only learn that if you go into that situation, and you better do that in a safe space that an exercise offers you, instead of learning all those things the hard way in the real crisis situation.
Yeah, it's you make a lot of good points. I mean, as you're talking through, my mind is going crazy of all the applications in which I've seen people who have had a plan, but either one, they didn't believe it was going to happen, or they had this low confidence that it was ever going to happen. So they didn't really prepare for it. And then when it happened, they were struggling to even get started to respond to this thing. Or when you were talking just right now, you spoke about this idea of training to fight, if you will. That, let's just put it that way, preparing yourself in a way that to react through simulation, like what your company does, where you guys are putting people into real scenarios and they're trying to see how they would react in these particular instances. And it reminded me of a conversation that I had when I was in the military, where we were training non-combatant soldiers. So let me rephrase that. Combat support soldiers. They weren't infantry people. So we were MAP guys and girls. And when you put them in a classroom and you're talking about, here's how you make maps. This is the data that you would use. This is how you do analysis to determine these things. In the classroom environment, everything is really protected. Everybody feels safe. And let's relate that to an organization. They're all protected. They feel safe. They think that there are security people on hand to respond to an issue. We have senior managers to help us get through them. And so the front line tends to relax a little bit, right? And then in those scenarios where we had soldiers learning how to make maps and do things and do intelligence, they would arrive at a real unit, and then real things would happen and they would struggle. And so what we did to change that was we created what we would call the Tactical Operations Center at the last 2 weeks, and we would give them complete uncertainty in everything that they did. They didn't know what they were going to make that day. They didn't know what issues they were going to have, if they were going to be under attack, what kind of missions they were going to work. And so it really put a lot of pressure on them. And whether they passed or failed was not the point. The point was to get them used to pressure. And I think that was one of those things that helped us evolve that particular type of coursework to get them ready for those things. And I think that lesson learned, if you will, helped me and helped others around me to respond to issues like this. And I think that I would be shocked if you didn't have the same, where you had lessons learned from things like that actually ended up helping you in today's world, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think crisis management actually takes a lot from the military, exercising and simulations included. So what we do when we run crisis trainings is basically the same that what you just described. We prepare a realistic scenario, and we, of course, don't let the participants of an exercise know beforehand what they will be experiencing. Most of them know, of course, they will have a crisis exercise. But then in terms of scenario and what will happen, we just, throw them into cold water, to actually train acting under pressure and, acting under uncertainty. It's not about winning the game. As you said, it's not about, being the best at that, whatever. Actually, in our exercises, usually if the group of participants performs really well, the exercise just gets tougher and tougher to challenge them. So it's really about learning and having a safe space to make mistakes, to not make them in the high stakes situation of a real crisis. That is really something where we see a lot of lessons learned for the participants, not just in terms of, okay, my crisis management plan doesn't work, or, we need another decision-making framework or something like that. But okay, I'm just personally I'm so stressed. I need 2 more people with me to do that task, or I need to be able to make decisions on this and that, or just the hierarchy sometimes within teams, or the social dynamics that play out in such a situation. Just to experience that helps a lot of our clients to then be ready to, do the real thing whenever something happens.
Yeah. How do you, if I were to ask you to come in and tell our new project managers how you would prepare for crisis? I mean, there's lots of answers there. Obviously, we can discern that just not from what we're talking about, but from any reading that anyone would do on crisis management. If you go visit preparedness.com, you'll see plenty of that on how to be prepared. But there's something that we could tell new leaders, new organizations who have not predominantly dealt with this before, or trying to make a new approach to managing these things. What would be a top line recommendation that you might have for newbies?
So I think the number one thing is get started in doing the prep work. It's better to do something than nothing. Mm-hmm. And as I said, crisis management is not rocket science. We do a lot of those things naturally, especially if you're in project management, or if you're a manager or in a leadership position. You probably know a thing or two about crisis management without even being aware of that. I think one of the top things to do is actually sitting down, thinking about what could happen, and then just go through one of the scenarios of your choice, and map out what you would do and what would happen, and note down your crisis team. Get your crisis team, inform them that they will be your crisis team, and set them up for success by, making clear what their role in a certain situation is. Mm-hmm. Write that down. Then, write down how you will make decisions, and how your crisis management cycle is. And make a really basic plan for when things go wrong. So we have that on hand if something happens. And then if you have additional time, I know schedules are packed. So, you don't have to start exercising with a, full scale functional crisis exercise. You can just get together for 1 or 2 hours, sit down together and, do what we call tabletop exercise. So map out a scenario that could happen and just discuss what you would do, to, get you into thinking like a crisis manager, to also get you confident if something happens, because you've talked about this before and what you need in that situation. But as said before, just start getting into that, start preparing, instead of, just saying, it will never happen to me, because at one point or the other, something will happen, and you mm-hmm. will be really, really happy if you have prepared for that or a similar situation.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, obviously, the minute that you say it probably won't happen to me is when it will, or it will. We'll sit back and wait with that Murphy's Law thing, right? It's going to sit back and wait until the absolute worst moment for it to come down on top of you, and it'll be on a Friday at 4:00, right before Christmas.
Yeah, so, usually crisis happens on the weekends when no one else is available.
That's true. And so Yeah. So as we've prepared for different things that are happening in terms of organizational crisis, we make plans, we have discussions, we do a couple of scenarios maybe. We have consultants like Prevency come in and help us get ready for these things or to sustain our operations in the middle of this. We also find that these crises can be not just inside the organization or just with a particular team, that these things could be responses to a global crisis, like you mentioned, in the beginning, COVID.
Yep.
For the United States government shut down, that could be a crisis. Issues with violence or world politics and just conflict, food shortages, water, natural things that are happening that creates problems in the world. And I know that it's hard for anybody to assume. They make all the assumptions, but it's hard for them to assume they'll be ready for anything, right? They have to pick out those top tier issues that would most likely impact them as an organization and kind of get their preparations in place for those. And so I think in terms of talking about you and the company, Prevency, for just a second, we could go on for hours about all the things you could do to prepare and how all the resources you could use to get people trained in response of that. Maybe you hire a dedicated crisis management person. Maybe you hire a consultant to come in and do spot checks and quality checks, if you will, on your organization's processes. And are you prepared for these things? Kind of like a fire inspection, if you will. How the real differentiator, though, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I looking at the website and talking to you before about these things and doing some reading on your articles and everything else, it's clear that it's the differentiator is the approach that groups like yours will use, like Prevency will use in terms of simulations and assessments. We're going to see how you act under pressure. We're going to use technology. We're going to use AI. We're going to do all these things to really put you into a position to respond to threats and crises that you will experience today. And so in terms of that, like Prevency's, could you give me a little bit of idea of like what the central line of Prevency's ideas of how they're going to help their clients get prepared for these crises, and what is there anything in that particular model that a company or a group could use to help get themselves ready as well?
Yeah, so again, what you said is I 100% agree with that. There's so many potential scenarios, future risks out there that, global risks that we don't have an impact on. And also let me say that you can prepare for so many crises scenarios or crises in general, but some things you cannot prevent,
Mm-hmm.
If you have an attack scenario, for example, cyber attack, if somebody really wants to hack your company, you can do so much cyber security. But if they have that criminal energy, they will find a way to do that. And same applies to crisis. So the real differentiator here is, are you prepared to manage kind of any crisis situation, not just one specific situation? And that's also our approach that we take with Prevency to increase crisis readiness across the whole organization for not just a cyber attack or a fire or, a pandemic or something like that, but to enable your organization and the people in the organization to manage almost any crisis themselves without having consultants coming in. That's actually also part of our business model, that we want to get organizations to the point where they can manage such situations by themselves without having to rely on consultants, on external experts, and so on, because your employees and your team members, they know your organization the best. They know it better than consultants. Maybe they have some blind spots sometimes. Yep, happens. But still, your crisis management team, for example, should be, in my opinion, at least, from within the organization.
Yeah.
So that's our approach with Prevency, to, on the one hand, train you in managing crisis, but also give you the tools and the capabilities to be able to do that by yourself. And usually that happens not with just one single exercise. Unfortunately, crisis exercising is like going to the gym. You have to train your crisis muscle, if you will, to stay in shape. Mm-hmm. Throughout the whole organization, and that's what we do, and that's what we aim for with our offering. So, for example, we when we started out at PREVENCY, because I joined the company when we were when it was just founded, and when we were starting out, we also did consulting, pretty ad hoc crisis management. So we have this 24/7 hotline that you could call if you are dealing with something, and then we would come in and help you. Mm. And we completely got rid of that business unit because we said, okay, we want to get our clients actually ready to do that by themselves and don't have to call us in the middle of the night to have them manage those things. And part of our job is also, it's not just the training itself. So not just, the day of the training where the participants come in and we exercise with them. A lot of the learnings and so on also happen before that, because we design the exercises and the scenarios together with our clients. And during that process, we often raise a lot of questions and a lot of, flags or things that, from an outsider's perspective might not make sense, or where we say, okay, that's a kind of a weak point that we can target in our scenarios or in our exercises. And our clients already learn a lot from that. As I said, and we talked about tools and methods and frameworks and so on. Part of the exercising is also stress testing those things. And then having your tool set, your people, and also your confidence and personal resilience for the actual crisis. And that's what we try to do, basically empower people and organizations to do crisis management.
Yeah, we've talked quite a bit about different things regarding this, and that, as we're getting ready to close this thing down, I think back at the very beginning of the podcast. Talking with you has really opened up a lot of ideas in my mind, and also some hopes. Right, I hope that those around me will listen to me as I brag a little bit about the things you've said, so that they get better prepared for these crises, right? Because they are a big deal. I think, especially in today's world where there's so much going on, technology's playing a huge part of everything. The stability of things around you just seem to be less stable than they used to be. And so I think the biggest thing that you said in this last bit was training someone to respond to this themselves. What was that saying that they said a long time ago? If you give a man a fish, you feed him for a day, but if you teach him to fish, you feed him for a lifetime. And I think that that's really important, because that's providing lasting value to an organization, to bring people like yourself, those experts, into the room and say, how can you help us manage crises that haven't evolved yet? Maybe we don't even know what we're thinking of. We don't know what we don't know. Help us understand and look forward to that stuff. And so, any closing comments before we get ready to wrap this up? But lots of things we've talked about. It's been amazing so far. But anything else that you'd like to think of? Talk about?
No, thank you for having me. I hope that for the listeners, could motivate you to get into crisis management a little bit more. Start, thinking about that, integrating that into day-to-day work. Because as said before, I think personally you can profit for that, and then the whole organization, of course. But it has been great talking to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining me today, chatting with me about this. It's really provided me a lot of insights. As I've mentioned before, I'll say it again. It's provided me a ton of insights and ideas on how to be better prepared for the inevitable crisis. As we've mentioned, it's not if, but when. And so I think preparation is the key to surviving those things. And I'm sure if I was a betting man, I'd bet everything I've got, which is not much, that the listeners are feeling the same way, that they are glad that they were able to listen to this and get the idea, hey, we need to be prepared for these things that are just a bit more than just your typical project risk. execution risk, financial risk, and those things. But we're talking about the big things that really matter. And I would love to certainly get you back on the show sometime because you have a large breadth of expertise in a number of areas that I think that we just in 45 minutes don't have time to go through. But I think it would be really important for that to happen again. So if you're open to it, please come back and talk with us more about that.
Yeah, would love to. Thank you.
Perfect. And to the listeners out there, if you're in need of expert consultation on crisis management and how to thrive in uncertainty, don't forget you can reach out to Sophia on LinkedIn. You can find out more on their website as well at PREVENCY, spelled PREVENCY.com, and just go in and ask questions, get in touch with them and ask them how they can make sure that you're ready to survive that next crisis. Hi, everyone. I hope you found the show valuable, and thank you again so much for joining us today. If you did find something valuable out of this and you really want to help us out, you can first start by subscribing to the show on your favorite podcast platform. You can also find us online at www.kalinavision.com. That's KALYN as in Nancy A-vision.com. And you can always help us out even more by going to buzzsprout.com and finding us there. The links will be down in the description. And making a small donation to the show to help keep the sound on. Again, thank you so much. Don't forget to subscribe and share this with your friends and colleagues. And until next time, make sure you take really good care of yourselves. And we look forward to seeing you on the next show. Thank you so much.